Call the meeting to order, and our first order of business, we'll have the Reverend Jim Newsom. Is Jim here? There he is.
There he is.
He will do the invocation, and then if you'll remain standing for Commissioner Bowden to lead you in the pledge.
Let us pray. Father, we thank you first for being our God, and second for allowing us to live in a place like this. It's such a wonderful, beautiful place. Father, then we pray for those who will be making decisions today and those who will be presenting. May each come without hidden agendas. May each come looking for the very best for this county and for all the people in it. We thank you, Father, for guiding and leading, and we ask our prayers in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'd like to introduce Mr. Eric Olson, who will do the introductions and give us an overview of where we're headed.
Good afternoon. Let me see if I can get this to work. It might actually work a little bit better. Again, good afternoon. I'm Eric Olson, Director of Utilities for Indian River County. We have today kind of an interesting meeting. It's one of these things that we're going to take a look at what we have today with respect to the future of Indian River County. Not only what we have today, but what we're going to be looking at for the next 25, 30, 40 years down the road. It's an important aspect of our future. It's something that is important to each and every one of us as a resident within the county. It's important for us in terms of our kids, in terms of what's going to be our future, but it's also equally important to the people that we work with in terms of the competing groups out there that might be looking at water as a resource into the future on our process. A little bit about why we're here. As many people are aware, Indian River County, and you're going to be hearing more detail on this as the presentation begins through a process of people, and I'll introduce some folks here in just a second. For the last year, Indian River County Utilities has been working towards the development of a construction project to expand the next phase of our water plant to the north at 58th and 77th, along with that with some additional wells that will go along with this. During the process of this, what you're going to hear about today is some concerns, and rightfully so, regarding what may be potential impacts to surrounding usages, specifically agricultural, residential. You're going to hear about today where we get our water in Indian River County, what are optional sources where we can get water today. And in the process of this discussions over the last year, we felt it important in working with various utility groups, the Agricultural Advisory Committee, the Soil and Water Conservation Board, that we take a look at not only today's needs, but we take a look into the future, 25, 30 years down the road, for not only what may be the most cost-effective, but realistically, the most reliable source of water for Indian River County. There's a lot of growth that you're going to hear about within the St. Lucie County area. You're going to hear about growth in the Brevard County area that may or may not be affecting us. You're going to hear things that you've heard in the past that you believe to be realities that may get clarification. Today we have to say we have an august body of experts here is probably an understatement. We have individuals from South Florida Water Management District that are in a position to give us discussions with respect to St. Lucie County, their perception of water supplies. Probably the most important, though, we have individuals led by the Executive Director of St. John's Water Management District, Kirby Green, to talk about issues that relate to St. John's River Water Management District Basin, specifically Indian River County, talking about that in terms of their perception of ourselves. You're going to get the real facts with respect to where they perceive water supply planning is for us in their eyes. They're going to give us guidance. Now, as the outcome of this meeting today, what you're going to be in a position to do is look at options. Options that may in fact be things that we look down the road as our future water supply source. And in the process of this, when we leave this meeting, we're going to basically delegate to our consultants to come back with a report, and basically you'll see a guideline of time frame associated with this, where you're going to come back and say, on the basis of our information, these are pluses, these are the minuses, these are the issues that are maybe attached to each of the options. So anyway, what I'd like to do is just first of all introduce some of the key people that we're going to be here today. Kirby Green, Executive Director, St. John's Water Management District. This is the guy that is at the top of the heap. In other words, you talk about when the buck stops, this is the guy where the buck stops right there. He has staff here that is the expert's expert we deal with St. John's quite often. Barbara Bagheera, her folks, if you want to introduce as we move along into this. We have some individuals representing not only Indian River County, but we have individuals from City of Vero Beach that were invited. We have individuals from Brevard County that were invited, along with individuals from St. Lucie County, City of Port St. Lucie, Fort Pierce Utilities. And the reasoning being is that we don't live in a world that we're isolated from each other. What they do in St. Lucie County, what they do in Brevard County, likewise what we do here affects each other in that sense. So what I'd like to do at this stage of the game is to basically turn it over to Mike Hotchkiss and Himanshu Mehta. What you're going to get is a little bit of a primer, if you will, on how Indian River County develops a understanding of what our growth pattern looks like. You're going to get a sense of what we're doing in our particular expansion, kind of get a sense of where we're heading on this process, and a little bit more detail. So with that in mind, Mike.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'm going to give you a little overview of what we presently have in our system, and just go over with you how we plan to meet our demand, plan to meet our growth, and how we go through a series of checks and balances to make sure we keep up with that demand, to make sure we have plenty of water to serve all of our customers in Indian River County. If I can get this to work. First of all, this is this shows our county within the South Florida area, and this first slide shows the 2 water treatment plants in the vicinity of the county. We have the North County plant up around Hobart Road. We call the Hobart plant, which a lot of people know. It's up around the north side of 77th Street and 58th Avenue. And we have the Oslo plant, a lot of people refer to, down around 9th Street Southwest and 15th Avenue. The 2 plants are interconnected, which means our distribution systems are all interconnected. All the transmission mains and distribution mains are all interconnected. So basically, either one of the plants could go down, and we could still serve all of our customers with one plant out of service and one plant running. The South plant has a capacity of 8.57 million gallons per day. The North plant has a capacity of 3.53 million gallons per day, total capacity of 12.11 million gallons per day. The South plant was our first plant that came online. They're both reverse osmosis plants. We get the water source presently from the upper Floridan aquifer, which is, our wells go down to about 720 feet, somewhere around there. We get our, let's go on to the next slide. This shows the distribution system, how they're interconnected. And we go on, this shows all the projects that we plan for. And basically, whenever a project comes on the system, they go through the site planning process, and then they make application, and they become a project, and we put them on the map. We first develop a master plan, which makes it, it gives us a demand from our master plan, and then we have we have our demand that we base all of our capacity on, and then from that we have a series of checks and balances we go through planning with to make sure that our demand's on track. And then from that, we interview a lot of developers and make sure that everything's in line. And then we also check with customer service to make sure all of our impact fees are coming in. And from that, we have a series of our demand. Go to this slide here. This shows our South County area, and this is our North County area. From all of our a series of demand, we developed this demand versus capacity curve, and this shows the demand with concurrency. And then from our checks and balances, from talking to developers and planning, and then checking with customer service to make sure we fine-tuned all of our demand, we have to make sure that we develop a capital improvement plan to make sure that all of our capital improvements have kept pace with all of our demand. And so we know right now we're at 12.1, and we know that our demand has kept pace, or our demand needs to increase up to meet our capacity needs to increase to keep pace with demand. So we know that right now we need to be in the process of expanding the North County RO plants. That's where we are now. So once we do that, we'll be good for up to the year 2011. So where we've been the last 5 years, the last 2 years, we've had a big influx of developers coming in from, say, the south area, West Palm Beach and so forth, and they've run out of they haven't had a lot of infrastructure down in St. Lucie County, and they've run out of water, like in St. Lucie County and whatnot. So we've had an abundant supply, not abundant, but we had a lot more capacity up here, and so they've come up here and they've started developing, and they've had a big influx of paying impact fees. So we've translated that into an increase in demand from what our normal master plan has shown, and so that has given us an increase of demand from what we've normally seen. So we had a big influx of development coming in, and then so we had this big influx of development and building, and then over the last year, there was due to a lot of speculative building, we started seeing the decrease. So we're constantly going through this checks and balances of increases and decreases, and so this last small decrease has been due to this speculative building. In other words, people weren't moving into the houses and whatnot, so we had a slight decrease. So based on checking with planning, customer service, our normal increase from, say, 3,000 units per year has gone down to about 2,000 units per year. So that's probably going to buy us a little bit of time for just a year to get caught up with all this development. So I guess the main emphasis we want to make today is we are normally doing a series of checks and balances to re-review our capital improvement plan. So we have to keep pace. It's not like roads where if they can't keep pace with development, then you just have to sit at a traffic light and wait a little bit longer. With us, if we don't keep pace with development, you run out of water, and that's a very serious problem. So right now, we've got, once we do this next series of development to get us to the 17.39 rated capacity, then we'll be good for 5 years. And when we develop a plant expansion, we have to do it in blocks of we do blocks of capacity of 1.5 MGD. We have to do it in skids of capacity, and we do it in a very minimum of 1.5. And it takes so long to get a permit and to do the construction. As you can see, once you start, from start to finish, it takes at least 5 years. So it's very important that we do it in big blocks. You can't just dial in capacity of 2 or 3 gallons per day. You have to do it in large blocks of capacity. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Due to all the concern about us using the upper Florida aquifer for our source of water, this is going to be the start of looking for other sources of water, and that's what Amanchi is going to talk about. So with that, I'd like to, well, one other thing I was going to talk about, whenever we look at population, we have to look at, also the impact fees to get paid. We convert all that into actual demand of gallons per day, and that's what, a lot of this chart shows. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanchi Mehta. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Himanshu Mehta, Utilities Department. I'm going to start by giving you a little overview of our plants, and then I'll go into the expansion and what the status is. As Mike had mentioned, our first plant, South Oro plant, was constructed in 1982. It's got a current operating capacity about 8.5 million gallons per day. The well field for our South plant, it consists of 6 upper Floridan aquifer wells. They range in size from 12-inch to 16-inch diameter, with an approximate depth of about 600 feet below land surface. Our current consumptive use permit does include a 7th well. However, this well has not yet been constructed. Generally, typically, the process, the raw water from the wells is processed using a reverse osmosis system, and we utilize 4 treatment skids at the South Oro facility. The picture there is a picture of one of our skids. The process results in basically 2 main components. The primary component being potable water, which at the South plant we can store up to 4 million gallons prior to distribution into the county water system. The secondary component is the concentrate that currently is permitted to discharge into the South Relief Canal. Currently, there are no plans for expansion of the South Oro plant. However, I want to emphasize there are no restrictions on the county to future expansions down there, given that all permit requirements are met. Get it? Thanks. Thanks, Joe. Our North Oro plant, we tell you a little about that. It was constructed in 1998. It's got a capacity of about 3.5 million gallons per day. The well field at the North facility, it consists of 3 Floridan aquifer wells. The diameter of those wells is 16-inch, and just like the South, they range down to a depth of 700 feet. At this plant, we use 2 RO skids to process the raw water, and we have a capacity there for 3 million gallons of on-site storage before distributing it into our system. The concentrate is currently permitted to discharge into the Indian River Lagoon. However, the county has proposed to relocate the discharge into the Spoonville Marsh site. This is a 62-acre former mosquito impoundment site along the Indian River Lagoon, for which Grand Harbor has granted a permanent easement to the county. Thanks. Now, just a status on the expansion, where we are. As I mentioned, we're expanding our North Oro plant. It is per a master plan perspective, which calls for a balanced water system. We have 8.5 MGD down at the south right now. We have 3.5 MGD at the north. We have only 2 skids there in the existing building, so we already have room for 2 more up there. So it's a logical step for us to go ahead and move to the north area. The current expansion to increase from 3.5 to about 8.8 MGD is by adding 3 production wells, adding 3 more RO skids. Now 2 is going to be in the existing building. We are expanding our process bay, and in the new bay we're going to install 1 more skid. We're also going to be adding additional storage via another 3 million gallon storage tank up there. The design element was authorized by the Commission in early 2004. The application for a DEP construction permit was applied in late 2004. The county recently has awarded a $21 million contract to Poole & Kent for construction, and which we expect to begin in the first quarter of 2007. The concentrate permit application for Spoonville Marsh was applied for on May 24, 2006. We are working with DEP on the industrial waste and the environmental resource permit. The consumptive use permit was applied for in July of this year. We're currently in the review response stage. However, we have received an approval for the installation and testing for the wells, which we plan on bidding out early in the year. Overall, the emphasis here is that design permitting for the expansion has been going on for the last 3 years, with construction period expected for another 2. We're working closely with the various permitting agencies and are confident that this expansion will allow Indian River County to meet the water demands for our residents. So what will we do after 2011? Originally, our plans were to continue to use the Florida aquifer. We were going to install another 3 wells there for a total of 9. We were going to add the other 3 skids and reach a complete build-out of 8 skids at the north facility. However, as Eric has mentioned, over the past years, we have received concerns from local boards, committees and groups and concerned citizens regarding impact to the existing legal users and their Floridan wells in terms of loss of flow and an increase in chlorides, saltwater intrusion. Although there have been a lot of models that have been done, both by the county and by the district, what we, in the process of working with these groups, what we came up with is to start a monitoring program to sample the neighboring artesian wells. And what we have right now, what we're going to probably have is 12 to 18 months of data before the 3 new wells go online to establish a baseline. And what we'll do from there is we'll continue the monitoring program. We'll be able to compare well by well as to what sort of impacts are going on. Again, for our consumptive use permit, there is a formal modeling process that we will have to go to. Our 3 wells are not, we don't have the official consumptive use permit, so there is a modeling phase of that we will have to go through. This effort, working with the groups, has reached a compromise and support for the expansion, the current expansion, and more importantly, to start the process for determining the future water supply for Indian River County in lieu of the final 3 wells. This has led to why we're here today and to looking at the future alternative sources for Indian River County. Just some general timeline on this. The Commission authorized Camp Dresser and McKee to prepare this alternative future water supply plan. Staff and CDM discussed these alternatives with the Utility Advisory Committee in early November, which has led to this workshop today. Our primary goal today is to give direction to Camp Dresser and McKee on what 4 or 5 alternatives or more to include in this master plan. Generally, the schedule from here is there's going to be a conceptual analysis that's going to be done by mid-January. We're going to discuss this with interested parties, and we're going to have a draft report and hold another public workshop to get some input from the Commission on the draft report, and then ultimately we'll come back in mid-April of next year with a recommendation as to what source we're going to use for the future. This aggressive schedule is needed to start this 4 to 5 year process of design, permitting, and construction for being in place to have the future supply by 2011 and beyond. With that, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pat Gleason.
Thanks, Amanchu. As Mike and Amanchu have indicated, Indian River County does have a demand for additional water. And I think as Amanchu just indicated, what we're talking about is in the next 5-year period, we are going to be expanding the use of the upper Floridan aquifer. Originally, there were 6 wells proposed, but because of citizen concerns, there are now 3 wells proposed for this next 5-year expansion. These 3 wells are going to be able to allow and supply basically raw water to the 3 new RO skids. This allows for the continued use of all the existing technology that you currently have, which is basically RO technology to produce potable water. Now, it goes without saying that in order to reduce demands on the Upper Florida Aquifer, Indian River County is going to continue to maximize its conservation of water by implementing as much reclaimed water usage as possible, as it has done in the past. I want to talk a little bit about the hydrogeology of the Florida Aquifer. This is a map of the Florida Aquifer, and there's a number of points I'd like to make about this. First of all, the Florida aquifer is really a huge aquifer, and if you look over here, you can see that the aquifer shown in gray actually extends up into South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, and underlies the entire part of the state, and that's really shown right here. It's huge in aerial extent. It's very deep. If you were to basically put a drilling rig right here in this room and drill down, you would encounter that aquifer somewhere around 450 to 500 feet. The recharge area for this is actually in a number of different places. It's in other states as well as in the central part of the state of Florida. And actually in these recharge areas, these are areas where you might find a lot of sinkholes. The water is relatively fresh, and you'll find some places in the Orlando area where the water is almost like rainwater in the aquifer. But as you get closer to the coastal areas and as you go farther south, the water becomes somewhat brackish. And right here, the water is slightly brackish. If you're going to produce potable water out of water from the Upper Florida aquifer here, then you have to use a reverse osmosis type of treatment to do that. The Florida aquifer is a very productive aquifer, and that's one of its advantages. And it's also very consistent in water quality, which makes it a great water to use for a public water supply. I want to talk about the sources of water that other neighboring utilities are using. And really the purpose of this slide, other than showing a lot of numbers up there, is to show you that there is a trend, and that trend is to, in the future, to move away from developing the superficial aquifer so much and move more into the Florida aquifer. And if you take a look at some of these utilities, Indian River County has currently 10 wells, which actually 9 have been constructed. The city of Vero Beach actually has a large number of superficial aquifer wells and some Floridan. And if you get down into St. Lucie County, you'll see there's a fair number of superficial aquifer wells and a lesser number of Floridan wells. But if you look over under proposed wells and what's going on there, okay, what wells are being proposed? And there aren't really any proposed superficial aquifer wells. It's all the wells that are being proposed are Upper Floridan wells. And as you can see, there's 54 Upper Floridan wells that are being proposed. So the trend is really to utilize this resource that's in the Florida aquifer. Now, if I could talk about that, what I've just talked about is what's going to sort of happen in the next 5 years. Okay, so what Indian River County has said is they'd like to look at an alternative to using the Upper Floridan after the next 5 years, starting basically in 2011. So what are we looking at here? We want the Indian River County had originally proposed 6 wells. They're just doing 3 now, holding off on the next 3. Okay, and so what would be an alternative to those next 3 wells? Okay, if an alternative is chosen, then that alternative has to be implemented in 5 years. That is, by 2011. You can't get to 2011 and decide you're going to choose something different then and start studying it and trying to implement it then. You have to really be starting now, as we are starting now, to find, if we're going to find an alternative to the Upper Floridan, we're starting now, today, to get it to where we can actually implement it in 2011. We would hope that that alternative would be a long-term alternative that wouldn't just be for another 5 years, but would be actually good for 20 years or more. And, we've looked at what those alternatives were. We've met with St. Johns River Water Management District, and they'll be discussing this more in the future here in just a few minutes, about possible alternatives. And of course, we're still looking at, as the Upper Floridan Aquifer as an alternative, if we can't find a longer range alternative that works. But there are some other ones that have been mentioned, and they are surface water and reservoirs. And I think we'll hear from the St. Johns River Water Management District, surface water, conserving surface water runoff, capturing storm water, building reservoirs and surface water treatment plants, that can be a long-range alternative water supply. The superficial aquifer. There may be places here in the county where the superficial aquifer could still be tapped. That might be a possibility. As you saw from a previous slide, Vero Beach does have a large number of wells. There's also seawater, an unlimited source of water, desalinization of seawater using high-pressure reverse osmosis. Another option, perhaps a little bit more expensive. Now, if some of these may actually take longer than 5 years to implement. In other words, if you're going to construct a reservoir, there's a lot involved in constructing a reservoir. It may take more than 5 years. You may not be able to implement that by 2011. It may be necessary to perhaps continue the use of the Upper Floridan wells to a point where you could build a reservoir and start building and get a surface water treatment plant and use that as a long-range alternative source of water. The other factor, of course, that it is a very big factor, must be taken into consideration, is the permitting of all of these. Permitting requirements, they are hurdles that have to be jumped, and they do take time. And for instance, if you're looking at seawater desalinization, it does you do end up with not only a nice drinking water product water, but you also end up with a concentrate, which is basically the salty water, and you've got to do something with that, and you've got to put it somewhere, and you've got to go through a permitting process to find out exactly where you can put that. So, having sort of given that as an introduction, I'd like to ask Kirby Green, Executive Director of the St. Johns River Water Management District, to talk about water supply opportunities in Indian River County.
Well, thank you for having us here today. This is an issue that, as you've read the newspapers over the last few months, is an issue that's all of Central Florida is facing, and we think probably to a lesser extent you at this point in time, but it's in your future. And it's very wise of you to be thinking about that now, because as Pat said, the short-term easy fixes you can probably get done in 5 or 6 years, but if you really start talking about an alternative source of water that's a desalinization plant or a surface water plant, you're probably looking at 7 to 12 years by the time we conceptualize it, get it a feasibility study done, capitalize the project, and build it. You're lucky if you get that first drop of water out of it 12 years out. So it's good that you're thinking about it now. What I'd like to do today is briefly go through what the district's role in water supply planning, water supply permitting is, and in water resource development, what we do in that arena. And so I'd like to start bureaucratically in the Florida statutes. Unfortunately, that's where we get our direction, or fortunately, that's where we get our direction. Depends on where you stand in this picture. In 1997, the legislature directed the water management districts to do the first set of water supply plans for the state. And they were supposed to do it for a 20-year period. So in 98, we did what was called a water supply assessment, which was an assessment that identified the population growth and demands in an area, and whether the sources of water that were being used currently or that were going to be used for the future that were identified by the local utilities would be able to meet those needs without having impacts to the environment. And I'll talk a little bit about what impacts to the environment means in a few minutes. But again, it required that we make that assessment on a 20-year demand, 20-year horizon. That was a 2000 snapshot of where we were. We had to update that. We have to update it every 5 years. So recently, this last February, we put out our 2005 edition of that. We did that in 2006 instead of 2005 because the legislature this past session made some changes that we needed to take into account. And so we delayed it until we could get those things in place. That was all wrapped up in what you probably have heard of as Senate Bill 444, which is a water sustainability and protection program that put state dollars into projects that developed alternative sources of water that met regional needs. That program allows up to a 40% cost share from the water management district and the state government to be matched by the utility in building alternative water sources. Okay. So the mission of the district is to implement regional strategies to ensure that there's water sources provided as needed for both the user, public supply users, and the environment. And there are two ways that we do that. One is through the consumptive use permitting process, which is our regulatory role, in that we have to look at proposals for consumptive uses of water and determine whether or not there are reasonable public use of that water. We have to determine whether or not it will interfere with existing users that already have consumptive use permits. And we have to make a determination that the environment's not going to be harmed by that use of water. And if you think back to the slide of the aquifer, you saw all the interconnectivity between the surface and where the aquifer was. As you pump water from the aquifer, you draw down the pressure around that withdrawal source, and it can impact the surface. It can impact lake levels. It can impact spring flows. It can impact river flow levels. It can impact wetlands. So we have to look at the way that a proposed water withdrawal will impact both those natural resources and existing users, and make a determination that won't happen before we can issue a consumptive use permit. So as you've heard in Central Florida, that we've set this magical date of 2013 as the date that the Florida aquifer will no longer support continued withdrawals of water beyond that constant level and not have an impact on the environment. So when we looked at the set of conditions around Central Florida, we came to the conclusion that about 2013 demand numbers, if you spread that out amongst all the users in the area, would be about the date when further withdrawals would have an impact on the environment, and we would not be able to permit that. And so we have those governments now working in the process of working with each other to develop alternative water sources and determine which sources they'll use to meet that need. Here, with the 2005 plan that was adopted, we worked with local governments, your governments, to determine what you thought a fair demand number would be. And that demand number is made up of two things. It's made up of a population projection, and it's made up of a per capita use number. Worked with your utilities and your planning people to determine what those demands would be. Taking all those demands into account and running a model to determine what the impacts of those withdrawals from the current sources would be, we felt that you had adequate sources to meet your needs for the next 20 years at the demands that we had used for that calculation. Now, all of that is site-specific, and it requires a permit, and it requires that some balancing occur. We think that you can meet that demand, but that doesn't mean that there won't be mitigation associated with the use of that water. One of those being, for instance, in the northern well field, I know that there have been concerns from agricultural users in the area that there may be interference with their wells if you continue to draw more water from that area. One of the things that you have to look at, your consultants have to look at as you go through the process of getting a permit and looking at the feasibility of using that water, is the trade-off between the mitigation of impacts by the use of that water at that site and having to go out and develop another source of water for yourself. Types of mitigations that are available are the deepening of wells, the moving of well points that may help offset some of those interference problems if they existed in a well field. One of the things you can't get around, though, is if you start to have higher chloride levels in those wells, it's indication that you've got either an upconing of saline water or an intrusion laterally from the coastal area. So that is something through the monitoring role that we would have to determine with your consultants if that could be mitigated, how it could be mitigated before you could continue to use those areas. So I think, if you go to the next slide, the end of that 2003-2005 process showed us an area that we called a priority water resource caution area. And it's the area that's shown in green on the maps on the screen. And you'll note that it's in the northern portions of Osceola County, from about the northern two-thirds of Brevard County, Orange, and that whole Central Florida area that we've been talking about. Indian River County was not included within that water resource caution area because we felt like that you could meet your water needs from those sources that you had currently identified. We are currently in the process of revising that and redoing those numbers. In 2008, we have to redo the assessment, so we'll be back with your utilities and your planning people in this next year, talking about what your demands are, what your population projections are going to be. Were we off in the last 5 years? Did we not predict enough growth? And how will that growth impact your water resources for the next 5-year cycle? So it's very important that you have your people engaged with us in that process so that we can get the proper predictions of both demand and what resources you want to use as we make those determinations. Again, if you go to we're at the next slide, okay? This slide is really stuff that we've already talked about. Brackish groundwater is the source that we thought that you could use through 2025 to meet your need. We know that you've got some interference concerns in the northern field. We thought that that probably could be addressed through mitigation in the permitting process, either through monitoring to determine whether or not you were getting increased chlorides in the area, and a way to mitigate those if that occurred. The future, you will continue to have a problem with concentrate management, as Dr. Gleason said, as you develop alternative sources and increase the amount of saline water that you use and put through your reverse osmosis plants, you will increase the amount of concentrate that you have to manage. That is beginning to be a bigger and bigger issue in the state, working with the Department of Environmental Protection and EPA, trying to determine where we can discharge that, how we can discharge it, so that we don't have problems in the area. We think that your potential for use of groundwater for your long-term needs are not going to be there. You're going to have to go to an alternative source water, and investigation of those alternative sources is wise at this point. Go to the next slide. Next slide, please. It is. Okay, we've been through this one. Next slide, I think is where we want to go. We think there are potential for a number of alternative source waters from surface water in the area. Actually, if we can go to the next slide, I think is probably the best. As most of you realize, the district has been engaged for years in the reconnection of former agricultural lands in the western part of your community back to the floodplain of the St. Johns River. That is Blue Cypress Lake, a number of our water resource projects that were built to improve water quality before that water was discharged back into the remaining floodplain of the St. Johns River as it made its way north. So the basis of most of that project design and area was for water quality and not for water quantity. We now recognize that another component of that project should be water supply, water resource development, and to hold that water where we can, to use it for water supply, for public supply. And so we're in the process of reanalyzing that whole project area to determine how we can maximize it for the water quality perspectives that we have to be concerned with, but also the water supply issues that we're going to be faced with in the next few years, or the next 50 years is what we really think. And we think there are a number of sources, they're indicated by the stars here, where we think that surface water can be collected and stored and made available to potential users both here and downstream as we move forward. These are very, very preliminary, but we have the ability out in the area that we just talked about, you've been talking about for a couple of months now, in the Sun Ag field area, where we're just purchasing 10,000 acres that we propose to make into both a shallow marsh and deep water reservoir for both water quality and water quantity needs. We also think that we need to be talking with South Florida about doing something down here at the C-25 and maybe capturing a lot of the water that's going to tide out of that system and either building a reservoir in that area or some way retaining that water so that we have it available for future use. we think that project in and of itself may generate as much as 200 to 300 million gallons of water a day that would be available both for environmental and for public supply needs. So that's something that we've been investigating for the last year, maybe a little longer than a year. The discussion's still going with South Florida on how we might be able to join together to build a project there and try to make that work. Of course, you know about the Indian River Farms projects and the possibilities of storing water within those canal systems and hold that water for either additional reclaimed water use to augment your reclaimed water supply or as a surface water source for groundwater needs. All of those projects, we think, are legitimate projects that we should be looking at along with you and other users in the area to determine their feasibility and how we should go about building them and the timing for building those projects to make them available for future use. Let's see, do we have another slide? We think if you look at those projects and you look at the estimates of about 6 million gallons a day for need coming out of those projects in the future, you can expect someplace between 250 per thousand gallons up in the neighborhood of 520, 550 per thousand gallons as reasonable costs coming from those systems. Of course, that'll depend on the type of treatment that'll be required, and hopefully, at least the front-end storage of the raw water will be partnering with you and with other people in building those reservoirs so that water is available. We think that a good portion of that part of the water supply equation is what we call water resource development, which is a responsibility of the district to have those waters available for y'all as you move forward. So we think that a lot of that will be borne at our cooperative with South Florida. Our recommendations is that we continue to coordinate our planning efforts with you. We think that we need to probably accelerate some of that. Our experiences in the Central Florida area are that the county and the municipalities within those counties have to understand what their water needs are before they can go out and start partnering with the neighboring communities to figure out what the best sources of water are going to be. We think that our experiences are showing us that it's real hard for you to do this on your own. You have to look regionally. You have to look for partners to help you in the projects, and we have to help you build coalitions of local governments that have a common need that we can move forward on. So we would encourage you with our help. We hope that you want our help to move into a planning process in the county with municipalities within the county so that you clearly understand what your internal demand needs are going to be over the next 20 to 50 years so that you know how to react with both the water management districts and with your neighbor counties as we go about developing those sources. And with that, I think, are we opening it for comments or?
We got one more.
One more? Okay. Thank you for having us here today.
I'm Mark Elsner. I'm the director of the South Florida Water Management District's Water Supply Implementation Division. And thank you for having us here today, because water supply is a top issue. We're in this together. You know, as Kirby alluded to, there's a lot of coordination and cooperation that goes on daily in the way of trying to address the future water needs of each district. And we try not to do it in isolation. You know, it's, as was indicated here today, we're looking at some of the same sources, and somehow we need to maximize the development of those sources while protecting that resource at the same time. Very similar to the St. John's district, we've developing 4 regional water supply plans that encompass our entire district. The Upper East Coast is one of those, and one of the oldest plans that we have, starting in the mid-90s. The first Upper East Coast plan was actually approved in 1998, and it was approved and updated in 2004. And the planning horizon for that was 2000 through 2025, and it still exists with the planned update in 2009. As Kirby mentioned, in 2005, new legislation was passed, Senate Bill 444, that required us to amend this project to be consistent with the requirements of Senate Bill 444, including project lists for how the utilities are going to meet their future needs, as well as updating those population projections. The 2004 plan did include analysis based on the knowledge at the time of population and water demands around the 2002-2003 time frame, and the plan concluded that there were adequate resources to meet those needs. Well, since then, and you know, if we had our crystal ball, you know, we've had several hurricanes come through here, some factors that have affected the agricultural industry, that these are dynamic plans and we need to keep continuing to update them, and that's why the legislature requires us on a 5-year basis to update that information based on the knowledge that's been gained over the last 5 years. And these are based, as Kirby indicated, a lot on local government and their plans and what's in their comprehensive plans. Again, we're not doing this in isolation. As part of the 2006 amendment, we didn't do analysis. We're in the process of tooling up for the 2009 update with updating our models and data collection. Planning area. One back, please. Okay. The Upper East Coast planning area consists of Martin, St. Lucie counties, and a little of eastern Okeechobee County. The population here, based on the 2006 amendment, is looking to increase by over 80% to almost 585,000 people. And the overall water demands are projected to increase about 30% to about 375 million gallons a day. In St. Lucie County, the population is projected to increase by almost double over the next 20 years to a little less than 400,000 people. Yeah. This shows the increase in demands that we're projecting over the next 20 years. The small bar on the left is the 2000 demands. The one on the right is the 2025. And in St. Lucie County, we're projecting demands to increase by 44 million gallons a day to about 61 million gallons a day by 2025. What sources are we going to be used to meet these needs? One, they're going to continue to maximize the use of surficial aquifer system. As Kirby indicated, recycling is a really big part in conservation of meeting the future needs, and new developments are incorporating dual water distribution systems in anticipation of reclaimed water becoming available, and use of the brackish Floridan aquifer. And in fact, there's 8 facilities using the Floridan aquifer there right now, incorporating desalination, and the municipalities are all planning on using the Floridan to meet the future needs. A couple other things in the 2004 plan was the C25 study, and that if you look at a map, there's very little storage within that basin, so when it rains, that water discharges to the estuary. We need to look at how can we keep that within the basin
And with the lack of storage in that basin, we've been working with the St. Johns River Water Management District on how can we utilize that water to go ahead and keep it back in the system and meet these growing needs. And with that, I'll go ahead and conclude my presentation to allow some time for discussion and questions.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. This next step, what I'd like to do is just take a second and kind of recap some of the points that Kirby has talked about and what Mark has talked about and Dr. Gleason and some of the other folks. After I do that, what I'd like to do is to then open it, some questions from the commission, and then after we, from that point, then go and ask if you have some public comment regarding some items. Dr. Gleason is going to kind of facilitate discussions that may be focused on specifics related to alternatives as we develop our plan. A couple of the issues that, just as kind of a recap, first of which there's been a little bit of discussion regarding the magic number of 2013 with respect to Florida and wells. A little bit of a clarification, I think, as you heard on that. That really is dealing with the Central Florida system. It's not, it wasn't envisioned as being part of the eastern coast areas, specifically Indian River County. A clarification, though, recognizing, and Kirby was very clear in that when you look beyond the periods of 20 years from now, there are no guarantees, and you've got to constantly come back and check and balance against the data as we see it today. But the 2013 number that a lot of people have seen, and perhaps in reports and various seminars, really refers to the problems that have occurred within the central part of the state in the Orange County area, which they've had some real difficult situations there. Another issue that I want to clarify is, and this is something that occasionally has been talked about, the seventh well, or expanding the south water plant. Currently, right now, actually the county has the ability to construct an additional seventh well in the south plant. We do not, nor have we submitted for a consumptive use permit for that seventh well. That's not part of the process. One of the things that we have to clarify, and we do have Mark from the South Florida Water Management District, a lot of unclarity and uncertainty has been around that indicates that South Florida will not let us construct any more wells or permit any more wells at the south plant. That's not correct. Actually, what it means is that they've actually changed some of the regulations a couple of years ago that addresses impacts related to flow wells and this sort of thing relative to ground surface area. What it really means is that if the county elects, Indian River County elects to expand in the south area with an additional well, we would submit a consumptive use permit application like any other process. It's reviewed and looked at in terms of its appropriateness. It's looked at it in terms of what might be considered a possible impact to a neighbor and this sort of thing. But there is no restriction related to additional seventh well or others within the south water plant like that. So it's important that we look at this thing and try to, as we project into the future. One other thing that Kirby clarified, and that is that in their 20-year plan, looking at the water supply plan for the St. Johns Water Management Basin, Indian River County, in looking at brackish, and when we define brackish water, we're talking Floridan wells, the 700-foot deep wells that are the same wells that we're currently using. The current projections with our population growth and with our current demands do not show this as being a concern at this point. The modeling that we're showing tends to indicate that same thing. But I want to, as with the other point related to the South Water Plant, that's today. We're here today because we're doing the right thing, and that is what we're saying to ourselves is we're looking beyond what we believe to be the certainty of the next 5 years and 10 years, and we're looking into the uncertainty of what might be 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the road. And I think what you saw between the lines, if not more directly from Kirby and from Mark, the trend, the short-term trend in St. Lucie County sure is going to the Floridan system, but you need to be more innovative beyond that. And I think that's why we're here today. If we were to limit ourselves to work and knowledge as we see it with the Floridan system and stick to that, I think 30 years from now, we'd be basically asking ourselves, why did we make such a short-term decision? So what I'd like to do at this stage of the game is turn it over to the Commission. If you have specific questions, we do have a staff, let me just say, extremely knowledgeable staff, in addition to Kirby and Mark and Dr. Gleason from South Florida Water Management District and St. John's. So if you've got some specific questions, we can direct. And then I'm going to, when we finish this, like I say, I just want to clarify, I'm going to turn it over to Pat so we can go to the public at that point.
Well, I think we ought to ask questions first, and then we can close with some more questions. Do you have any questions, Dale?
Looking at the C-25 issue that you're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, and this may be a Bob question, C-25, does it stop at about, what is that, 154th Heritage Road? Where does C-25, when it comes east from the St. John's Water Control District, how far east does it go?
I don't want to steal any of Elsner's thunder, but C-54, C-52.
C-24, or 25.
25 comes up from Fort Pierce, runs up along the canal and stops basically at Evans, where it jumps over into Scott's 2000, which would be pretty well in line with the old C-52 alignment of St. John.
But what I'm thinking is, and we'll have the opportunity of meeting with some of the people from the Cloud Grove Development. They got 1,200 acres right close into this area. And if we're needing a reservoir for the south end of that, and they're trying to put 6,000 units to the south side of the Indian River County line, that may be a good spot for us to start with a reservoir and connect C-24 in. But my question more poignantly, I suppose, it would be to Mr. Green. Indian River County, as I see it, we've got a lot of surface water. My question is whose water is that?
It's the environment's. And to the extent that the public can use it without harming the environment through consumptive use permits, people, individuals, communities are given the right to use that water for a period of time, as long as they can show that that the uses that they are going to put it to are beneficial uses and aren't harming other people. So I would say, in the larger extent, that it's the environment. It's something that I think we hold in trust for the citizens of Florida and the environment of Florida, and are charged with trying to manage in that way.
So let me ask you another question then. Looking at the Farm 13 Stick Marsh, that total reservoir, is that about 4,000 acres?
I think it's 6,000.
6,000? Okay. All right, so the 10,000 acres that they're talking about putting adjacent to it,
Yes, sir.
and that would be again for the environment?
No.
Okay, that's where I'm going.
What we're doing is, as the Upper Basin Project was originally envisioned after the Central and South Florida, we changed from that, was purely a water quality project. With this 10,000 acres and with the plumbing and the rest of that Upper Basin project, we've now asked our engineers to go back and figure out how to maximize both the water quality component of that and provide for water resource development for water supply. So those projects, especially the 10,000 acre Sun Ag piece, really has a joint purpose. It's water quality, yes, but it's also water quantity. And those things are having to be balanced as we go through the design phase of that project. So I think you're going to see a shift of what was almost purely a water quality into some type of a balanced water quality, water quantity management of that area for future need.
Then that goes, I guess, to my next question then, is it would be a water quantity issue, or water for who? I mean, and I don't mean to keep beating around the bush on this. My question is as I look out to our water resources, they're clearly to the west, and there's nothing. I do understand that the philosophy shift that the St. John's has taken. It used to be more about sheet flow and creating the basin and letting the basin continue its flow north to Jacksonville. And now we are having to look at it more as for a usage issue, and we don't want to take away from the environmental aspects of what we have out west of town. But we've got a relatively simple connection to this reservoir through the 10,000 acres and the 6,000 acres of the stick marsh right through C-54. That could relatively easily connect into an infrastructure that we have at the North County well fields, a little bit of treatment, and address a lot of our water concerns in the future, if we knew that was the residents of Indian River County, the agricultural interest of Indian River County, and the environmental interests of Indian River County's water.
Well, it's not your water. To the degree that you need that water, that the agriculture needs that water in the area, they can get permits for the use of that water, as long as it's not having an impact on the environment, as long as it's not having an impact on other users in that area. So I can't stand here today and say every drop of water that goes into that basin is the property of Indian River County and will be managed solely for the use of the public within Indian River County, because that's not true. We're going to have to protect the environment. We're going to have to provide water to the environment first, but to the degree that management of that water meets that environmental goal, but also can meet the water quantity needs of the area, then we can accommodate that as we build projects. And in fact, that's exactly what we've challenged our engineering staff and environmental scientists to do. Figure out a way that we can maximize this project for those two purposes. So if we know in the design process of that 10,000 acre reservoir that there's going to be a need for water here, then we can accommodate that in the design. Beyond that, though, I think the bigger issue for a lot of us that have been working in this area is to figure out a way that we can take that water that's going down the St. Lucie and being discharged in that area. How do we capture that, move some of it back up into this upper basin area, or keep it in a reservoir for our needs? If we can do that, it looks like we may have something in excess of 200 million gallons a day of water that we can use for those other purposes, which all plays into the equation of environment versus public need.
Okay. Thank you.
Peter?
Mr. Green, while you're up there, historically, a lot of that freshwater sheet flowed across the county and then entered the Indian River Lagoon. And we actually had a very freshwater lagoon with oysters and such until the inlets came in. Now we're brackish. When we start storing all that water upland, and the future use for it may be to send it south or north, how are you going to make sure that we get adequate flow to the lagoon to keep it in a brackish state, not just become totally salt? That's one question. The other is, and maybe just clarify for my interest on the aquifer and the recharge areas, I understand are more possibly in Georgia and North Florida, and then Dr. Gleason mentioned Central Florida. So I guess my understanding is the water is recharged to the north of us and then basically flows south. Is that correct?
Well, we don't have a bathtub. I mean, there's not this big open water source down there that that we're all drawing water from. It's more like a sponge. There are all these little voids in between sand particles and rock and that where water collects, and it moves through that system from South Carolina to here, maybe over 1,000 years. So your local uses are really driven by your ability to locally recharge the area. He's absolutely right. It's all part of a geologic system that starts in South Carolina and is the coastal plain. But for your thinking, you need to be thinking kind of locally. You're not getting a whole lot of water from South Carolina. None is what. So.
Okay, well, I guess looking at the presentation here, St. Lucie County and Port St. Lucie are going to be drilling 51 new wells into the aquifer. So that seems to be their primary source of future water. Brevard's not doing anything, so I'm not sure where they're going to get their water from. And it just seems like we're the only ones who are going to be storing water.
Well, if you look at Brevard County, if you look at Melbourne and that area, they're getting a good portion of their water out of Lake Washington, which is water coming down out of the Upper Basin Project and into that area. If you go to Cocoa, they're getting water from a surface water reservoir. They also have groundwater sources. So they have a blend that is going to rely more and more on surface water to help meet that need. So there's a mixture in the northern.
And does their plan show that that's going to be sufficient for their population growth, with Palm Bay growing to a couple, 300,000 people? Are those sources of water going to be sufficient for 2025?
I'm going to have to look at staff to answer that question.
Okay.
Barbara, can you?
Yeah, can I just say regionally, within that Central Florida area, which extends down about 2/3 of the way through Brevard County, there would be problems meeting the 2025 demands regionally because of the decline in the potentiometric surfaces projected throughout that Central Florida area. And if you look at that map that Kirby had on the screen of the priority water resource caution areas, you'll see they come down and include the Melbourne and West Melbourne area, not Palm Bay. But they do go.
Okay, have you looked at the Palm Bay projections and how that all factors in?
Yes, we did that. We did that to create this map in 2003, and as he said, we're in the process right now of doing that again for our 2008 assessment. We're right there right now, and it's too early to tell what the result's going to be. It may include areas further to the south.
Okay.
That was Barbara Vigera.
I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. And then my last concern is with all the wells going down in St. Lucie County, how that is going to affect our wells, the current wells we're using now in our South County. You know, are those 51 additional wells going to be drawing down the aquifer and affect our wells? And if that were to happen, you know, you'd mentioned it's a good 7 to 12 years to develop an alternate water supply. And I guess the question for South Florida, it doesn't look like St. Lucie County is doing any acquisition for, you know, storm or rainwater, surface water storage. So if those wells start drawing down our wells for 12 years, what do we do until they start doing something? I guess I'm just a little concerned that there's a lot of development going into the south and very little surface water storage, and it doesn't seem like there's any alternative supply going on down there other than just more aquifer wells.
Yeah, a couple things. I think it's important to note that those are wells that are in an application but aren't permitted yet. We have those applications in-house. They're currently being reviewed, you know, in accordance with criteria, looking at population projections, the modeling, drawdowns. And I think it's important to know, there's been a lot of talk about Central Florida, but the Florida aquifer is very different here than it is up in Orlando, and that there is no communication between land surface and the Florida aquifer. It's a confined aquifer down in St. Lucie County. The top of it's maybe 800 to 1,000 feet deep and deeper. So it's not recharged from the surface in this area. So the two things that we're looking at from Florida aquifer is changes in head or changes in water level, and the resulting change in water quality. And, and we're still learning more about the Florida aquifer. It's been used for a long time by agriculture in this area, but long-term data, hasn't been collected for the last 50 years. So we're catching up. We're developing the tools to do that. So we do have applications in-house from Port St. Lucie. St. Lucie County just submitted one for use of the Florida aquifer, and those are currently being evaluated. So, everything here is just proposed, but nothing's been approved yet.
And I think it's important. I think it's important that we understand that the permitting process in both districts require that we take into account existing users and interference with those existing users. So, if modeling started to show that there were impacts being caused, either with chloride, saltwater intrusion, or interference in well depth, then we would have to be talking about whether or not those additional wells could be permitted.
If I may, Mark and Kirby on and Commissioners.
Or maybe if we could have the hand mic, maybe hand it back that way so we can get everything on record. When you're in the audience, we don't pick up a lot.
You hard of hearing, Gary?
My name's Bob Yulovich. I'm the
But now I can use this one, right? My name is Bob Yulovich. I'm the administrator for the St. Johns and Sebastian water control districts. I've also been involved with Kirby and the St. Johns folks and Mark and the South Florida folks on what I call the reconnection of the two water management districts. I'm sure there's some folks in here that haven't been around before 1972. Prior to 1972, 1973, South Florida and St. John's were all one water district, and they were Central and South Florida Flood Control Project. And then legislatively, they were disconnected, so to speak, and St. John's was created and South Florida was created by Chapter 373. In the old days, that was connected, and water ran north and south. What we've done with the two water districts and some local interests, including the county and St. Lucie County, is that we've looked at the potential reconnection, and as a result, we've looked at the ability to divert hundreds of thousands of acre feet from going in the lagoon. So you have the water quality issue that Kirby talked about and others. We also looked at the potential of storing water in the not only western Indian River County, but also western St. Lucie County. Wesley mentioned potential discussions with Cloud Grove. That's within that footprint, because the water, the map's not up here, but the water used to come down and run along between the county line, go down Minute Maid Road, and go into C-25 extension. So the idea there is to run the water north and south and use it as a repository for time of need. When you have times of need now, like we have, we can take the water out, we can keep it from going into the lagoon, we can reduce sediment and nutrients going into the lagoon. So it's a win-win from a water quality, a water quantity, and a recharge of groundwater. I believe that that project is in its second phase. The first phase was determine the feasibility of this. In other words, determine whether or not Bob Yulovich was nuts. And post-Buckley is determined I'm not totally insane, and we have potential, as Kirby's saying, to get a whole bunch of water out there. The second phase is, I believe, the two water management districts are talking about now, essentially designing the damn thing and seeing what it's going to cost, where to place it, where's the footprint. And that footprint involves western St. Lucie County, western Indian River County, and looks at, and it's not my idea, it actually is a resurrection of a 1952-1954 document that was authorized by Congress when the Central and South Florida Flood Control Project was initially created in the late 40s. So this isn't new thinking. This is basically new old thinking. So Kirby was talking about, and I thought appropriate for me to kind of jump in here and explain and address some of the St. Lucie County, are they in on with, and they are, and in storing water in the western boundaries there. Okay.
Thank you. We'll get to the audience a little bit. Did you have anything, Sandy?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just a couple of things. I want to go back to the 10,000 acre water reserve out here, or whatever we're going to call it. Regional is the buzzword that we hear now. Everybody wants to be, considered regional, and we need to look at the regional needs. Well, I'm elected to look at Indian River County needs and want to make sure that we're top priority in this. Do we have access, or are we on the pecking order? Do we have access? Tell us what our real, we're going to store this water. Do we ever get to use it if we need it?
Well, if you apply for a permit and you can show that that is a beneficial use of the water, then yes, you can get a permit to use.
Do we have
some
to
of it.
do some of it?
Some of it. We have to take care of the environment first.
The environment being the environment in Indian River County, in the region, and like, just for example, I believe probably Suwannee County has the most water in the state of Florida probably, and the least legislators, and that water probably is going to flow down Tampa, St. Pete area, whatever, because they already have water wars over there. We don't want to get to that point here. And so I really want to understand if we have any dubs to this water.
Sitting here today, you have no dubs to that water.
Right, okay.
Okay?
But
the only way you can ensure that is to move to an alternative water source, show your need, and get a consumptive use permit for that.
And how long would that take reasonably?
And can we do that before it's even built?
Yes. I mean, we're really serious. We pride ourselves in this community of being exceptional, and it's because the forefathers that came before us planned well, and we're trying to plan well and go on for the future for our children, our grandchildren, or whatever. So we're not just up here, spending your time.
Yeah,
we really want to know these types of critical answers.
Yeah,
and how to get there.
And part of the issue is in designing that project, there are some pre-existing uses in the area. The Sun Ag people have right of use of some of the water from Blue Cypress Lake and the Blue Cypress Water Management Area. We're shifting those around to be part of this reservoir. So if you were to ask me today, who has top priority for that water right now, if the reservoir was built and in place today, part of it would go to Sun Ag for their ag operation. Part of it would go into the environment, and there are no other users of that water. We have thought about the way to manage the upper basin so that we can deliver more water to the St. John's during low flow, where there will be more water available at Lake Washington for Melbourne's use, and further down the river at Taylor Creek Reservoir for the use in that part of the area. So it's all part of a process, but how much water we can release down depends on what the needs are going to be here, both from a public supply perspective, an environmental perspective. What does the river need to be a healthy river? What do the marshlands out in the western part of the community or western part of the county need to make it reasonably healthy, and what does the public need? So all of that gets balanced. That's as good an answer as I can give you right now.
Okay, we need to take a 10-minute break for captioning, and then we'll come back and continue with the questions. Thank you. Got anything else to hand me there, buddy?
Tomorrow about
Your Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Your Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Your Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Your Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment.
Back to order, please. No, I don't think so. He's late for everything. Who's worse than last week? Okay. We're going to wind up the commission asking questions, and then we'll open it up to the public shortly, where you can ask your questions. My questions that I have are a little more elementary than Wesley's were. What I'm concerned about, and I want to ask a question first with, I don't know whether Mr. Green or who would answer it, but my question is, as we look to the future at desalinization or whatever as was up there, does that mean that we're just not going to be able to draw more than a certain amount out of the aquifer, or is that water going to disappear and we need a whole new supply? In other words, is the aquifer going to continue to feed us at a certain level, and when we reach that level, then we have to look to desalinization or other sources?
Mr. Chairman, my name is Mike Slayton. I'm also with St. John's Water Management District. Until Mr. Green comes in, I'll try to fill his shoes. I think the key to it is diversifying sources. Looking at superficial wells, looking at deeper wells with reverse osmosis, looking at surface water sources. You know, if you put all your eggs in one basket and you drop your basket, you ain't got no eggs. And the key to it is really diversifying like a good portfolio. You want to spread out your assets.
Well, let me use an example then. It's kind of like I've got a job making $100 a week to feed my family, and now my family's grown by 2, and I need $150 a week to feed my family. Do I get a second job, or do I get a new job that gives me $150 a week? In other words, because are we going to have this much water in the aquifer we continue to use, then we look at other sources to supplement that, or do we have to? Yes, there is a finite source amount of water in the aquifer, and there's a lesser amount of that you can tap into. Okay. So we're still going to have that water, but as we grow, we need other sources. Yes, sir. Okay, that was my. The other thing, a couple other questions. You know, assuming population is the source of our demand on water, and assuming that we're able to control our population in Indian River County, which we're trying to do, and apparently the counties to the south and the north of us are trying to grow as rapidly as possible, and there's so much water out there, and we go through the permitting process, are they going to have access where it could hurt us water-wise simply because I think Palm Bay's projections are over 300,000 people at build out. We've got what's going on in St. Lucie County, and we're going to be a really small populated area, hopefully, in the middle of 2 larger counties that are growing very rapidly. And how are we going to be able to compete for water for our county with the massive growth to the north and south of us?
I think you're going to be in the same footing as those other communities, because as Mr. Elsner said, the large number of wells that are being applied for are just that. They're paper wells. They have no water. They have no substance to them. They have to measure it against the criteria on impact on existing users, on the environment, and they also have to, we have to take into account by statute reasonably projected growth. And it's incumbent upon us and South Florida to develop water resources and to make sure the resources are available to meet that growth by statute. If your community decides to grow at a slower rate, that means that your need for additional water is going to come at a later time. And you'll have to look at what the options are as that later time approaches, as to figure out what the best avenue to pursue is.
Okay. Wesley.
Yes. Tonight in Palm Bay, I believe they're having a final reading on another annexation. Is it tomorrow night? Thank you. And that's how I found out, by the way. Appreciate y'all calling me.
I thought you knew all this stuff.
Well, I do, but it's because they're telling me. And I guess this goes right back to the 10,000 acres again. We had a joint meeting with Brevard County. By the way, I saw Commissioner Volz's aide. I don't know if he's still here or not. He was here earlier. looking at Palm Bay's southern border now being right at the Marier Bridge on the C-54 canal, that's immediately north of this 10,000 acres that the St. John's is looking at expanding. And I guess really getting straight to the point is, do we need to now say, okay, this is going to be our future source of water before it's built, start laying the future lines or the future claim to that water so that we'll be first in line, and if this was going to be our first source our first available resource of fresh water in the future, and therefore annexations from Palm Bay, they'll have to go to other areas, or if there's water left over in this area, they can tap into that? Is that what I'm...
Well, I'd defer to Kirby to correct me, but an application can't be made until you have an existing need or a reasonably projected need during the life of that permit. And presently, the maximum life of permits are 20 years. If you anticipate growth needs now and in the next 20 years needing that water, fill out an application, make it, and we'll evaluate it against the criteria for the resources and the existing users.
Mr. Olson, are we to that point?
That's why we're here today.
Go ahead.
Let me clarify something. You know, if you go back to the chart that basically showed the growth spikes in terms of where we're at, and I think as Dr. Gleason said, and we'll reiterate this thing again, we have on today's construction, what's been approved by the commission, the water plant with the wells that are going to be coming into place, we believe that we have capacity with those in place for another 5-6 years, give or take, like that. What we're saying today is that we need to make a decision by the end of this, let's say by spring. We need to be in a position to be able to say, okay, our next capacity, wherever that comes from, needs to be in place roughly somewhere in around 2011, 2012, and it shifts a little bit. So to get to your point, we will be at a point in spring, and let's say hypothetically, and I don't want to presuppose the information that gets formulated by CDM in this process. Let's suppose that CDM comes back and in conjunction with the next workshop, we conclude that our future source is really sort of a composite of what we have today plus a superficial system. It's a mixed bag of information. You'll probably get a lot of people, myself included, that will say maybe that's not a bad idea. But having said that, by springtime, we will be at a point where we will be starting to identify that to a point where we're saying, okay, that's the direction we're going, if superficial is that. The key at that point will be whether we have enough information to where we can then submit a consumptive use permit, because I think the key that Mike Slayton was saying, you can't bank your allocation, so to speak. In other words, when you submit your water supply allocation, if you were to submit it to Mark down at South Florida or to Barbara up at St. John's, whatever the case is, you've got to be in a position to say, my needs today are ... And then they look at that and they match you against existing users, environment, et cetera, like this. To answer the question, we may in fact be at a point by this summer, let's just say this summer, to be at a point where we might be able to say, yes, we're beginning to see this is the amount we need, this is the direction we're going, we're ready to submit this application process. So the answer is yes.
Okay, Mr. Green?
Just a little bit of follow-up on that. We mentioned that we're getting ready to start the next assessment process. That assessment process looks at what your proposed sources are to meet your demand. If y'all this spring start telling Barbara and her staff that you realize you've got a cap on your aquifer withdrawals and this is going to be your second choice, then she starts to use that as she figures out how much water is available for other purposes, and that starts getting built into the planning process.
Eric, just let me ask you a question. Looking at this chart up here, we got about 131,000 people living in the county today. if we can maintain, urban service line, if we can maintain development as we've done at build-out in this county, we're going to be 280, 290,000 people. Look at this chart and take the percentages. That's about where you are in 2025 to supply that population if all things are relative as far as water we're using today per person.
As best as our crystal ball is, yeah.
Yeah. So you know, we're in pretty good shape if we control our population in this county and say our build-out in this county is going to be, you know, 280,000, 290,000 versus like, you know, maybe Dade County wants 3 million at ultimate build-out. And I think that's what I want to understand. So we're not in bad shape in this county with the water, the permitting that we would need to reach that goal in 2025. Are those permits going to be available?
Let me clarify that, because that's, again, why we're here today. Today, as we sit here today, based on the construction project that's about to be underway, I mean, it's already been awarded, and the 3 wells that we're going to be putting in place, you'll see that first jump. It puts us up to 17.39. It takes us out to the right to 2011, 2012, and by the way, there's no perfection to those graphs. Those are rough best guesses. Once we get to that point to the right at 2011, 2012, that next jump isn't defined as to where it's coming from. That's the key. That goes back to Commissioner Bowden, her point, and your point in terms of being able to say, okay, what do we need to be in a position to be able to do this summer? Because that decision has to take place by this summer, because it takes 4 years just to the simple processing of permitting and design and the mechanics of construction. It's even worse if you consider the possibility, and Kirby hit it right on the button. Let's suppose that we decide in August or this summer, we're going to go to a superficial supplementation process. What that means is maybe we're going to dig a canal from the basin system. Well, the basin system isn't really implemented yet at this point, so you've got to assume some time element associated with the basin out west. That's got to come into play. You've got to assume some construction. So you're really basically a little bit further out in the process, but the important point back to the question is that we need to be in a position to be able to say, this summer, we will probably allocate, if that decision is, and I don't want to presuppose any decision, desalinization could be an option, whatever the process, we don't want to presuppose anything. But we will make a selection, and at that point, once that process is made, then we're going to begin the process of permitting, going through that preliminary consideration. Barbara has the magic with her staff of going through looking at it in terms of basically putting into the computer modeling and being able to say, okay, here's what we can do for you, here's how we can do it, and that's when the process begins.
Sandra?
Just one last question for now. The consumption use permit that we perhaps, will be able to put in line is, did Felsmer have to do a CUP? Felsmer Farms?
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
They have an existing one from their use that's been going on for quite some time.
So it's a grandfathered?
No. It's just
No, it's an ongoing.
It's like the county has an existing permit.
This is Rich Berkeley. He's out of our Palm Bay, St. John's office.
Joe, did you?
Palm Bay as well?
Yes.
So the consumptive permits are already in?
Yes.
For those 300,000 units?
No.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
So if we were to apply for a consumptive use permit now, will we inevitably be pumping water towards Palm Bay when they do expand?
Rich, let me see if I understand your question. Let me clarify this. Let's say build-out population is 280,000 for Indian River County. If I understand where you're going, if we can't submit a permit for a build-out population of 280,000, St. John's staff would look at us and say, no, you don't have a realistic perspective of your near-term usage and demands, because that's a criteria as part of their consumptive use permitting. Palm Bay has to go through the same process. Palm Bay cannot just simply say, and we would like something for 500,000 people, and we want to bank that forever, and we're going to allocate it, we're going to grab it today. They can't do that at this point. They've got to go through a process saying our near-term 20-year projections, and depending as to how their permit application is specified, they've got to actually say specifically, this is what our demand will be, and they've got to address it pretty clearly. But it wouldn't necessarily address 280,000 people or 300,000 people, whichever the case is. But whatever ultimately is there will have to be permitted through a process of demonstrated need.
And I guess, Mr. Chairman, just one last thing. I think that's our concern, that I don't think we want to get in this water war race, that the communities that build out the fastest can get their consumptive use permits in first and get the water. I mean, that's penalizing us because we might have a better, slower managed growth. And what you guys are saying is, if somebody else says, no, we're going to hit 300,000 first, then they can put their permit in, and so we're penalized for doing good managed growth.
Well, Kirby, and he basically addressed that, I think, just in this way, and please correct me if I'm wrong. If you envision, if we at Indian River County say, look, we have no need for water for 20 years, we're good. Whatever we've got, we're good, and everything is not a problem. We're not going to submit any more applications. We're just good with what we've got for 20 years. You've got to accept, basically, the conditions that may exist 20 years from now. That's the dilemma. And I believe if
Maybe a blessing.
in a sense, this is what Kirby is saying. And the reasoning for that is that it's a changing process. I mean, we're looking at the situation here. Indian River County began 25 years ago going into reverse osmosis, Floridan wells, and frankly, that was the recommendation. Go into Floridan systems. It's a bountiful water supply. It's great. It's predictable. But we're in a different set of conditions today.
Okay.
So,
thank you, Eric. We're going to open this up now for the public to speak. And if we've got anybody in either one of these wings or whatever, we can use both podiums. So, John, if you want to come up, anyone over here on this side want to speak, if you come to this podium, and we'll just go back and forth. I'll recognize one or the other, and then if you want to speak, head up when one finishes.
Good afternoon,
Please give us your name and address.
My name is John Higgs. I live at 45 Wax Myrtle Way, and I have two questions that relate to the subject of the relative quantity of water that is used by agriculture vis-a-vis low-density development. First question relates to the basis of the projections which have been used. Are they based upon, we're talking about land outside the urban service line, are the projections that are being used, which of course are scary as far as water consumption is concerned, are they based upon that land being used as it is today? If it's used at all, it's for agriculture with very little low-density development, or is it based upon the maximum build-out of the existing permitted low-density development, whether it's 5, 10, one house per 5 acres, one house per 10 acres, or one house per...
about that projection up there?
Yes. Or is it based upon a mix? Now, my second question, if I may, then I will sit down. Which uses more water? The type of agriculture which we now have in Indian River County, which of course is a mixed bag, I realize, or low-density residential uses of the 5, 10, or 20 that is permitted?
I'm going to answer the first part. When you look at that graph up there, it makes no assumptions that any change in the urban service boundary. It makes no assumptions related to density changes whatsoever. Basically, what it's doing, it's taking existing growth within the county. Basically, as you saw that map early on that talks about the number of developments out there, it takes a look at the developments within the urban service boundary. It takes a look at the current existing density based on the comp plan. Those generate themselves basically out of the planning system that we have here. It then translates that into what is expected growth. That's where you get the two curves. Incidentally, just for clarification, the two curves that you saw on that slope, the bottom, for purposes of just information, the bottom is really what comes out of the plant. It's that immediate, we turned the water plant on today, we measured it the morning, we measure it tomorrow, 24 hours later. That's that bottom line. When you come in and pay your impact fee, basically we assume that you may turn around and be a customer 6 months from now. We add that into the mix, so that's the secondary line. But the answer to the question is, we do not assume any changes in density or urban service boundary.
I'm afraid I apologize. I did not state my question clearly enough. My question was based upon the existing zoning and the existing urban service line. The existing urban service line permits developments, 1 unit per 5 acres, 1 unit per 10 acres, and 1 unit per 20 acres, depending on where they are.
Outside the line.
Outside the line. So I'll repeat my question. Assuming the law doesn't change, are your projections made upon that property being used largely for agricultural use as it is today, or is it made on the basis of the permitted development under the existing law?
I apologize. I'll make another stab at it. Basically, again, that graph, if you look at the projection graph, it's actually more mathematical than it is a plan. If you look at this thing, we look at the existing units that have come in for permit. In other words, those that have come to the TRC process, those that have come to Planning and Zoning Commission, those that have been approved by the Commission. We look over the last several years, we look at today's set of circumstances, and we look and project 2 years from now. Mathematically, we estimate what that slope is going to be. So that assumes absolutely no change. We make no assumption of change. We're assuming the conditions remain static. In other words, that suddenly nothing opens your land use designation, so where somehow or other instead of a 1 in 5 you get 5 units per acre, that type of thing. We don't make that assumption into the process. We have to assume that the current level of approval process maintains itself.
Let me take a stab at that, because I still don't think it's quite answering as I understood the question. And you were talking about ag property outside the urban service line. And we're really not into that, because everything we do is within the urban service line for our permitting.
Absolutely.
So everything outside the urban service line would do their own permitting through artesian wells or whatever with St. John's.
Right.
And would be separate from what we're doing here now, because we don't supply water outside that line except under special circumstances.
So let me try to answer it from the larger perspective.
We'll get it.
In the planning process, when we do the water supply assessment, not only are we looking at your urban service boundary, but we're looking at what the conversion outside of those boundaries has been, and we're talking to the county planner and to the people in the community on almost a census block basis, looking at how it's going to be developed in the future. And Barbara and her staff are making projections based off of possible conversions of those lands on a historic basis. So even though your use projections for your purposes, for your utility projections, may not indicate growth in those areas, Barbara's trying to capture that in the water supply assessment portion to make sure that there's water available for those purposes there. And she's looking at a per capita use and looking at the conversion from ag to urban and that interface as she does it.
I think also, though, that under our current comprehensive land use plan, we're supplying water services and making them available inside the urban service line. Currently, outside our urban service line, it's either agricultural or ranchettes, which they have to do their own well, home septic, etc. If a village was created somewhere west of town, under our current law that's allowed, then they would have to, I would assume, probably build their own water plant, get their own permit, and supply their own village. They wouldn't necessarily look to the county for that service. So that would be something that you'd have to deal with independently of what we're doing. But I think that's what we're talking about with the water. So, okay, thank you. Are there other, Bob?
If I may, thank you, Bob Swift, 6450 Glendale Road. I just want to try to change the dynamic just a little bit here. We've been talking about supply, and there were a couple of points made in the presentations on conservation, but it's certainly something that I would hope would be put into the equation and looked at very, very closely by the county. Our current development practices, especially our landscaping practices with lot line to lot line, St. Augustine, consume a huge amount of water. Now, that water is coming out of the superficial aquifer. It's not coming out of our potable supply in the Floridan aquifer, but it's still a tremendous waste of water. And I know that Dick Baker and Jens are working on new landscape ordinances for the county, but there is a tremendous opportunity to save water through our landscape and our management practices. And I would hope that the county would take this opportunity to establish a leadership role and maybe even set a goal of a per capita water consumption reduction by a given year. And if you look at the numbers out there, I mean, the potential is huge in terms of the amount of water that could be saved. Either through community, more incentives for reuse. Everything that we do, we use reuse wall to wall. All the residential lots are used by reuse. We've entered into a cost share agreement with the district to take water out of the main relief canal. So we're reusing water that's probably already been used in agriculture 2 or 3 times to help irrigate residential uses. So there are a lot of things out there that could be done, and I would hope that the county would take a leadership role in that. I also have to say I'm reminded about 22 years ago, I took a plane ride across the state with a land planner who was my mentor, and I looked out the window and I said, gee, there's a lot of land out there. And he looked at me and says, you're going to run out of water long before you run out of land. And that was 22 years ago, so Bob was pretty prescient on that. I would encourage that leadership role, and it's an opportunity for the county to really step up to it.
Bob, I think your point's well taken, but I think it needs to be done probably statewide or at least regionally, because what little bit we do in our county isn't going to have much of an effect if they aren't doing it in St. Lucie, Brevard, Broward, Dade. And, maybe the state ought to be looking at this and come up with standards on what you can do with plantings and grass and water usage. I'm not trying to sidestep it either. I think anything you can do locally is a positive, but I think that this is becoming, from what I'm hearing, such a serious problem that we need to look at it bigger than county by county.
I agree. I agree with you, Gary, but somebody's got to take the lead and start. And one of the failures of Florida is the fact that we do not have a statewide water management policy.
Maybe we ought to add that to our list as a suggestion when we go over to...
If you remember when the Tampa started the desalinization plant, the day that they announced the start of that desalinization plant on the West Coast, the Corps of Engineers announced that they were going to be dumping the equivalent of a swimming pool worth of water out of Lake Okeechobee to the East Coast. So, those are the kinds of things that need to be addressed. And you're right, it is a global issue. It's a regional issue. It's a statewide issue. But it also begins with each individual here.
I agree.
And the county could certainly take a leadership role in that.
Good point. Thank you, Bob.
Vic DiMattia, Vero Beach. I'd like to build on what Bob has said. When I first came to Vero Beach, I found out that 100 feet from my house was a gray water pipe, and I was not allowed to hook up to it because there was not sufficient capacity to meet the needs today. What that means is that for every 3 gallons of potable water that we make today, about 1 of them goes inside the house and the other 2 stay outside. So we could perhaps triple our potable water capacity if we could provide gray water, mostly for our yards, our irrigation, our pools, and outside uses. We run a lot of water into the lagoon through this town every day. If we could capture some of that and impound it, have it be our water, and use that that would triple our capacity. Thank you.
P. Gardner, 4480 25th Lane. First of all, I want to congratulate our elected officials up here, because from every comment that I heard from every one of you, you're on the right track and you're representing us in Indian River County. I do believe that that is what your responsibility is, and the way I'm hearing things, it almost seems like we're being punished for being growth management conscious. And it sounds like we're being put into a priority situation with managing water for everybody around us that's not being as conscientious about growth as we are. And I can understand what Bob Swift was just saying, you know, it's wonderful to be able to conserve, but that doesn't do us any good because we're already conserving when it comes to growth. We're doing a lot of things that we're being surrounded by other counties that aren't. And I'm also a little bit put out by the, quote, application process. I don't see where our growth management in this county is going to get us in line to get an application. I think it's going to be a punishment that we'll find down the road. So what I'm understanding, and I'm not very technical on this issue, I'm just looking at the big picture just like you folks are right now. What bothers me the most from what I can gather is that we are not represented by this particular group. I don't believe Indian River County has a representative sitting on the Water Management District. I don't know if I'm right on that, but I think I am. And I think that that's maybe a first step that we need to take in this county. And I'm sure you're going to get to that point, but I'm just going to put my 2 cents worth in on that.
Thank you.
My name is Jens Tripson, 2525 14th Street, Vero Beach. I want to thank Kirby and the St. John's staff and Indian River County staff in South Florida for getting this dialogue going. My father was on the governing board of the St. John's River Water Management District in the 70s and 80s, as well as the St. John's Water Control District, and they told him he couldn't do both because of conflict of interest, but he saw then, or thought then, that they were interconnected, and as we're hearing, they are. I think with this group, we're gonna come up with some viable plans. I was really glad to hear the stress on a certain amount of water for the environment. And I think as we develop these plans, that you need to keep in mind that RO and desalination have the most detrimental impact on the environment. Treating surface water, for the most part, is less toxic to the environment than desal or especially RO. And that should really factor into our long-range plans of what we're going to do for a potable water source. Thank you.
Thank you.
David Cox, Periwinkle Lane. Thank you all for doing this. This is great. Thanks for coming all the way down from wherever you came from, Palatka, I guess. Somewhere way out there. I like timelines, and what I heard today was, I guess, a little unsettling. I want to make sure that I get this clear. In 2007, we're going to have 3 new RO wells that are going to come online in the North County. That's going to carry us out to, I think you said 2011, 2012, something like that, 5 years. And Kirby said that take minimum 12 years, 7 to 12 years to develop a surface water source. So if we started that tomorrow morning, that would be 2018. And so we got 2011, we got to do something. We know we're going to have to do something in 2011. And we know that if we started surface water source planning now, that could take until 2018. I think there's 7 years in there.
And so we're going to have to do something. If our growth projections, which I guess are based on past performance, if they actually do go out the way that we're guesstimating. So we're either looking at 3 more skids somewhere in North County or maybe in a different spot or something. But anyway, I think that for me, that's what the way I kind of need to think about these things. And then when you're thinking about sources, it sounded like you guys were really trying to steer us away from thinking about using the marshes up north of Blue Cypress and maybe head towards what Bob's talking about, which is 200 to 300 million gallons per day that could be developed down in the C25 extension area. And that's a possible source. The marshes are obviously a source. Wesley, you mentioned the C54 possibly serving a role in providing us some, and I guess there's the other areas where we have potential sources are east of I-95 with water control districts there. We're losing options there. We're losing flexibility there every day in terms of being able to have enough aerial extent to stock water. But I guess all those are the potential geographic source areas, and I think that it's going to be very interesting to see over the next year or so this process play out and how we're going to decide what we're going to decide to do for these next steps and to address that critical period from 2011 to pulled out roughly 2025 or whenever that may happen. But again, I want to thank you all for putting this on and providing us with all of this good information. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Mr. Gunner.
Good evening. Almost. I'm David Gunner, 5280 22nd Street. I'm the chairman of the Board of Supervisors for the Indian River Soil and Water Conservation District. And I guess we're the board that stirred the pot on this thing. When utilities came and we found out about their consumptive use permit application for 6 wells in that area, and knowing what the county uses for their production wells, they use a 16-inch well with a 100-foot deep turbine in it, compared to what the normal agricultural or other consumptive use permit holders use, and that's just a flow well. You open the valve and the water flows. So that gives the county and utilities an edge on the volume of water that they can move and the probability, in our opinion, of causing upconing of the chlorides, higher chloride water underneath the freshwater lens that we're actually using. And we felt that intuitively there was going to be issues, and we talked to Eric and his staff and the consultants from CDM, and we recommended that they start immediately a monitoring program, because the condition of your consumptive use permit that you receive from the St. Johns River Water Management District is going to be that you cannot adversely affect existing consumptive use permit holders more than 10% on quality or quantity. Now, and if you do, then you'll have to mitigate that take. And Mr. Green alluded to that in his presentation. But my question to you and to Mr. Green is, if I have an 8-inch flow well that I'm using to irrigate 100 acres of citrus with, and the chlorides go from 800 parts to 2,100 parts, and I'm within 1.5 miles, 2 miles of this well field, you can't mitigate that take by lowering digging my well deeper, because you're going to get more salt. My question to you is, how do you replace my water? Do you run a pipe and pipe me potable water to use for irrigation? That's not the the best use of that water, but, I am an existing consumptive use permit holder, so how do you mitigate the take on quality? Mr. Green?
Well, under the circumstances that you described, it'll be very hard to mitigate those impacts, and we'll have.
How do they do it? It will be up to them. It will at least be their dime.
Well, that's a decision that they have to make. I mean, they have to, if they think that they can mitigate that impact at a lesser cost than going out and developing an alternative water source, then that becomes an economic decision that the person that would interfere with your well would have to look at. There are ways to do that. They could choose to. There are any number of things. They could choose to try to stop if it's intrusion instead of coning. They may try to build a barrier of some other water source to keep it from moving further inland. If it's coning, it's going to be much harder for them to deal with.
Well, then they would essentially have to shut down those production wells until that freshwater lens builds back to the density that it was beforehand, and that would you'd have to cross your fingers to do that.
But they and we will be doing a lot of modeling, and I know it's you're throwing stuff in a black box and you get an answer out of it.
A model is only as good as the data that you can put in it.
But they will have to develop an alternative plan if they start to see those chloride levels starting to increase. That doesn't mean that it'll get all the way to the point that it starts to have an impact on you. They'll have to have a mitigation plan. That mitigation plan may be that they have to reduce pumping in one area and increase pumping in another area. But they'll have to, that plan will have to be flushed out as part of the permit process.
Okay, well, I wanted the commissioners to realize that it's not as simple as just getting a consumptive use permit. There are other issues that come into play if it's, if government takes, or if I, as a new permitted user, if my consumptive use takes from an existing user, I have to mitigate it. So, but your equipment is more apt to generate a take than an open flow well would. So,
you know what it sounds like? It kind of sounds like you're in the same position with the county and their well fields as we are with Brevard and St. Lucie County and their well fields.
But the problem,
bigger you are, the more important you are, and the less attention you get.
But the deal is, St. John's has got you on the hook. And if you take from me as an existing CUP holder, you're going to have to fix it. And so, that's why we asked Mr. Olson and the consultants. I said, well, do you have a plan B? And they said, well, not right now, but we can work on getting a plan B. So, and, you see that very neat straight line on the graph. The demand is not that flat. It's got spikes up and down in it. There are other options. More storage, either ASR or above ground storage. Above ground storage is very expensive. But that's what this is all about. And I appreciate, the county stepping up and saying, well, let's look for other sources and look at, it's your dime. And I don't want to spend it because I'm adding to the pot. So whatever's the cheapest and best, I think you folks will make the right decision. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Karen Abel. I live at 909 Seagrape Lane in Vero Beach. I have the same concerns that many of the county commissioners have, and B. Gardner, other people who have spoken. that the water management practices don't harm the residents of Indian River County. I have an observation that the CUP criteria is faulted and needs to be modified. Under the current definition, it rewards irresponsible users and penalizes responsible users. And by that I mean the growth practices. What's missing from that criteria set is a criterion on fair share use, which should be predicated on equalized growth rates, not real growth rates. If you're looking at real growth rates, you've got a county to the south and a county to the north that do not have any checks and balances. They are just explosive growth rates. And I don't think that's the way water management should be handled. I think it should be handled on a much more fair share basis. So that's my observation and my request and proposal to the water management districts.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Frank Wagle, 8060 142nd Street, Ursul Dune Heights, unincorporated, Indian River County. We've heard about how bad the reverse osmosis plants are for the environment with what comes out of them. Now, let's say the county decided, instead of doing new wells, that we're going to start capping the wells. Would the St. John's then take that into account to giving us more surface water from the reservoir that you're going to be building automatically? Because we're doing a lot for the environment if we cap those wells.
I think the answer is if you decide to move to another source and you have a justifiable quantity from the source that you're moving from, you can, in the permit process, I think you can assume that use would be recognized from the new source, if that answers the question. So I don't know if it'll be guaranteed, but it's reasonable to think that if you quit using one source that you've justified a certain amount out of and you move to another source, as long as that second source will accommodate that amount of water, then yes.
Okay, well, that's the answer I hope to hear, because hopefully then, we could start capping these wells instead of building new ones and go to the Fellsmere Farms area. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Eckert?
My name is Deborah Ecker. I live at 550 Riomar Drive. I'm picking up on a comment that Mr. Green made, in which Mr. Green stated that the last time they looked at Indian River's population numbers and water needs, that it looked like we were fine for 20 years. Last spring, I took some time. I had somebody gave me the CDs on which you did your recent water study, and I also had put up on spreadsheets the numbers that are developed by our own county's Department of Community Development on the number of approvals of projects. And when calculating the number, I'm not talking pipeline, I'm talking actual approvals of projects between 2000 and 2005. And then I used a multiplier, the multiplier that is used by the Bureau of the Census to calculate what they calculate in terms of what they assume in terms of the number of people living in each unit. And when that came out to be a figure, Mr. Green, that showed that if those all approvals were taking place, that we were now, at the end of 2005, at 75% of the population projection that your numbers have for the whole 20 years. Now, I've discussed this with, that's, before I rush on, that's a big number. And it does mean that we may, and I also heard you say, and I was pleased to hear you say it, that you're planning to re-examine those numbers and to maybe do some modification in those, and I would certainly say that is needed. I have talked with Mr. Keating about this, and he reassures me that just because these numbers of units have been approved, it doesn't mean they're going to be built right away. But those are approved, and it's taken the developers a good deal of money and investment to bring them to that point. And it seems to me that it's likely that those are going to come online and be really occupied units. So I think that we may not have the comfort that we've been talking about in terms of time on dealing with these issues and the needs for this county's water.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you.
Anyone else wish to be heard? Lex?
I'm Lex Crumhout, Vero Beach. I'm going to try to bring in a farmer's perspective on this thing, and one that's been through the consumptive use allocation process now for the second time, and share some of my experiences picking up off of some of the comments that David Gunner made also. I'd also like to come back to something that Sandra was addressing with you, Mr. Green, with respects to the circumstances of Indian River County and the water that it currently holds within the borders of the county itself. From a farmer's perspective, I am on the south side of the Blue Cypress East Reservoir area on the Upper Basin Project. We've been there for over 50 years before water management was in place, and we've kind of felt warm and comfortable being grandfathered in, and then the laws change, and we have to fall into this permitting process. And in that permitting process, you learn a lot of things. We are a self-contained farm, what we like to think of as a closed unit, but even then the laws come into your boundaries. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to you all is that this allocation process is a moving target. It doesn't end. And Mr. Green is repeatedly commenting on that perspective. You know, if we at Indian River County could adhere to and maintain that master plan up there, it would be wonderful, especially if the Water Management District could put some priority on the fact that we are being responsible in Indian River County and maintaining the population limits so that we don't put any more burden on the water supply. I have no doubt that 30 years from now, water is going to be a critical issue. I've already seen it in our farming enterprise. My family started off in flowers. In flowers, especially in gladiolas, you have to flood the land for 7 years in order to get rid of the nematodes. It takes a lot of water to do that. We did it by rotating our property around and keeping it flooded. Well, then you run into new environmental issues, and as we did that, we start running into wetlands issues and plants that we put in place as a result of our activities, causing us problems. Those things are not so much of an issue with the amount of land that we have in western Indian River County, simply because the water is intended for the environment, and the environment is going back to its natural state, despite the fact that much of that land is higher than where we're sitting right now. But anyway, if we were able to control our growth in Indian River County, if Indian River County was able to take advantage of improving circumstances by creating surface water storage and providing for reverse osmosis and other things, implementing conservation, finding ways to take our coastal drainage districts and holding that water back from stormwater tide and conserving and placing that water into surface storage areas. I would hope that the Water Management District would find some way to place a priority on the residents in this area and their water needs in relation to other areas that are growing very fast and in many ways, in my opinion, and I think the Commission is alluding to that too, irresponsibly in relation to the impact on the environment. We here recognize our environment. We're very concerned about it. We appreciate what the Water Management District has done for us, but we also recognize the cost to our county for doing it. A lot of land has come off of that tax roll. There's a lot of expense for farmers like myself to have to pump against that head of water that you've created out there. And we in turn would like to see some reward for that in future allocations, especially when the allocation process is a moving target all the time. When you come back 20 years from now, there are more of us. If we could contain these walls and contain the people in them, it would be easy, but we can't do that. That's the flaw in your system. And if we are responsible, how do you deal with those that are not responsible in the allocation process? Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Lex. Anyone else wish to be heard? Mr. Dare? Yeah.
Well, good evening. I guess we qualify for evening at this point. My name is Robert Adair. I'm the vice chairman on the SWCD with David Gunter. David made some really good points that I also wanted to provide some additional information, if that's okay. I was wondering if anybody from anybody, I guess, attending here today has any idea of how many permitted wells are in our county. These wells would be any well 6 inches in diameter. Predominantly, most of those are 6-inch diameter wells or greater. Right here to orientate you, well, let's do it this way. Oops, we won't do it that way. Okay, this is I-95. This is Highway 60. North County well field. It's hard to see these little dots right here, but each one of those represents, I need a technical assistant here. Each one of those represents a permitted well. The correct answers are 617 in the northeast portion of our county, and there's 1,520 throughout the county. Now, we don't know for sure how far any adverse impacts would go, but I can tell you right now, as any other grower that may be here, or you can ask and check with them to validate it, is that during a time of freeze and during a time of drought, we already see reduced artesian flow. We already see increase in total dissolved solids. At my place of employment, Florida Research Center, we have 2 6-inch artesian wells that are permitted. We monitor those wells monthly. We've seen the TDS go up over the last 20 years. Currently, our TDS is around 1,900 parts per million. When I first came to those wells, they were around 1,150 parts per million total dissolved solids. At some point during drought, correct me if I'm wrong, according to my rain gauge to center, we're about 24 inches behind last year. Of course, last year we had a hurricane. Before that, it was all bets were off. We had too much water, if anything. What we're concerned about is not during the average rainfall conditions. We're concerned about during periods of drought and during periods of a freeze, being able to use that water to sustain our agriculture in the county. What we've seen in freeze events like December of '89, where all those wells were opened, the artesian flow was diminished to the point where one could not flood their grows. And flooding is how citrus growers protect their trees, as ultimately and then hopefully protect their crop. There's been some discussion about the models. I've had the privilege of meeting Dr. David Tove. In fact, he came and visited the SWCD board. He also made a presentation in our local community, sponsored by the Pelican Island Audubon Society. He has presented information about his hydrology models. Those models indicate, and I guess I can quote from those, he says, and this is the one that he dated in 2000, that it should be noted, and this was with existing county use in year 2000, it should be noted that during drought conditions, the natural artesian flow could be marginal. In a later report that he presented in 2005, he mentioned that, again, that these artesian flows would be marginal and would be likely. He also indicated that it would also be likely that due to upconing, and you got to understand there's a big difference between saltwater intrusion, which is a horizontal movement of saltwater, and upconing, which is a vertical movement. The water stratifies according to its density with a less dense, fresher water on the surface. When you start, as Mr. Gunter alluded to, when you start pumping those waters, you create a vortex within the liquid layer, and the denser water starts to come up. It quickly can happen, and it slowly, ever so slowly, can then go back down as the water restratifies when you stop pumping. But it happens quicker than it goes away. That's a major problem. The other thing I'd like to point out is that in our county, when you look at all the counties within the St. John's Water Management District, we're moderate in our use of groundwater, but surprisingly, very high in our surface water. We're blessed with a lot of surface water. If you can see the highlighted areas in yellow, Indian River County uses around 72 million gallons per day of surface water, and around 112 million gallons per day, I said that right, of surface water. The groundwater is 72. And if you'll look at all the different counties, you can see that we're highest in the use of surface water. Presumably that water is for agricultural use. And what's not used either percolates down or flows north predominantly, with a few exceptions going to the south, as other speakers have indicated. One of the things that we're concerned about, and I think the county commission needs to be concerned about, besides the agricultural ramifications and the mitigation costs to agriculture, with the changing nature in our landscape, particularly outside the urban service area, the so-called small farms, ranchettes, martini farms, horse farms, all these types of things that are occurring to the east of 95 and to the west of the urban service area, and that niche of our county. A lot of those people are not using that water for potable or for irrigation use. There's a changing landscape to more of small farmers, like I illustrated, and so therefore their water supply would, if it were impacted, then the county would be responsible for providing water to them, or a pump or financial means to do that. If the county were to have to supply water to them, you've effectively increased your urban service area. Some of the solutions that our board has talked about is the idea of increasing reuse water. We think this should be pursued extremely expeditiously. The idea of being able to reuse and a very high efficiency ratio, as one of your other speakers said, has been documented, and Mr. Olson has alluded to that also. It's expensive. Your new developments that are coming in here, the old term, I think, was gray pipe or gray water. The new term is now purple pipe. The idea of bringing that water to these developments, and then someone, the homeowner, the developer, impact fees, somehow pays for that purple pipe to go to each household. I think what's currently going on right now is that purple pipe in the new developments is running into your retention areas. Those retention areas are to hold storm water. They're being compromised when they also serve as a reservoir. If you have a high rainfall event and they're full with water for reuse, then you're not going to be able to retain that water. I think that's contradictory. We've also mentioned, and I believe this came through the Agricultural Advisory Committee that I chair, through Commissioner Davis, the importance of the county aggressively pursuing well plugging. We think this is also a very important thing. I think possibly we may need more funding to do that. So there's some real proactive things we can do, but there's definitely some very, very distinct pitfalls. The St. John's River Water Management District, in conjunction with Southwest Florida, came up with a recommended action plan for Central Florida Coordination Area on September 18, 2006. I think it's noteworthy for me just to read the opening sentence on the executive summary, just so that you're aware of how critical the situation is in Central Florida, I believe also in our county. The districts have each concluded through detailed water supply planning and individual permit actions that the growth in public water supply over the next 20 years in Central Florida from traditional groundwater sources is not sustainable. I recall having a workshop here a year ago in November where we told we did have a sustainable water supply based on artesian water. I don't want to beat anybody up over that, but I think it's true that we don't have a sustainable water supply using artesian wells. I think it's an imminent decision that needs to be made now to pursue aggressively, expeditiously, a surface water program. I feel also in this action plan, and this has been discussed in another meeting with Robert Christensen, concerned by individuals, our county administrator was there, Joe Baird, that when this Central Florida Coordination Area was developed, and I'll show this, unfortunately, our county was left out of this. Why was it left out of here? The reason is that we didn't have a critical need for water as the other rapidly growing areas did. You've heard other speakers allude to this. We really do feel that it's punitive to committees that are exercising diligence on controlling their growth and preserving their natural resources, that then when we realize that the surface water is the more sustainable way to go, is a way of protecting our natural resources, is a way of protecting our environment, that we get penalized as Indian River County is left out of this critical area. So I would suggest to the County Commission that we do work with Mr. Green, with the Board of Directors at St. John's, do consider getting representation on that board, and cooperatively, collaboratively work with them to provide funding and a wherewithal to look to give our county a truly sustainable water supply, to be a model for the district to do the right thing. And you saw the picture that you had up there, Jill, that showed all the different sources in the county. If you all look at that, the Felsmere Farm area was left off, and C-54 was put on. Correct me if I'm wrong, I thought one of the purposes of that new water management area was to prevent water going into C-54. So, but we can work these things out. I really believe that with all our water control districts that are on that picture, this image up here, as well as what you see up there, with our canal system that was designed to remove water off the land, we could make this into a silver lining and use this as aqueducts or water distribution systems. So I applaud the effort by the county to look for these new supplies. And lastly, I'll conclude, sorry for taking so long, I'll conclude with the following, is that I really believe that we've got the wrong name for this workshop, and it is that we're not looking for an alternative water supply. Let the wells be the alternative supply, and let the surface water and surface water reservoirs be the sustainable supply. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to deal with them.
Thank you, Mr. Bear. Anyone else?
May I?
Yes.
I know it's getting late. But I think it's important to say happy holidays, everybody. You too, Michael. Thank you.
And a Merry Christmas to you.
Yes, sir. Couple things. We go through consumptive use permit. I'll tie into Lex there too. The two districts of primary agriculture, and I want to tell you, we get drugged through the coals. You know, Berkeley will beat you up and all that stuff. And we are primarily on surface and secondary on wells. My comments are directed, I have one comment to the commission for their future determination, and I share one of my concerns in life with Kirby. The first thing is my concerns in life with Kirby. Kirby's heard that you know, the good kids think that they're being punished, and I'm reminded of my situation with my family. I'm blessed with 5 children. My 2 sons, all they care about is boats and dogs. But my daughters are more rooted in reality. And around Christmas time, I have 3 daughters. One practices zero growth control, one has slow growth control, and the other one has accelerated growth control. the two daughters that practice slow and no growth control kind of bring up the issue that at Christmas time there's an inequitable distribution of wealth. We can call it water, okay? And I don't have an answer to her. You know, I tell her talk to Mom because Mom controls the resources. So I think Kirby's heard that. You know, I think I've known the water management districts for all my life, for 35 years, and I know that the philosophy is that those who put forth a positive effort will be rewarded. So I don't think the curtain's dropped on this situation. My last comment is to the board. When I leave here, I'm going to go see my 92-year-old mom, who I'm blessed with taking care of, and who still has wise things in life that she's instilled in me. My mom, of the Slovakian descent, who lived through the Depression, practiced short-term economic solutions to potentially long-term problems. So my mom's idea was to put a penny behind the fuse box, or to put a 50 amp in a 15 amp spot, and it solved the problem. We had a short-term solution to a problem. When the firemen had to come take the ceiling down in the basement, we had a long-term solution. From a elected official position, I mean, you guys are balanced with taxation, representation, and you don't want to be known as folks who promote taxation. So you're faced with this, you know, you got an opportunity to look at putting a penny behind the fuse, and putting additional straws in the aquifer, or rewiring the house. Okay, and it's your choice. Okay, that's it. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Anyone else? If not, we'll bring this to a conclusion, but I'd just like to ask Eric and also Mr. Green, and we can't take any action at this because it's a workshop, but I would like to see in a short period of time a synopsis coming back with a plan of action as to what we're going to pursue, whether we're going to pursue a sense of fair share, or, as Lex pointed out, reward for good growth management, or what. I just want to know what we've accomplished at this meeting and where it's going to take us, and some kind of a potential timetable as to what we can expect in the future, either yes or no answers to some of these questions.
We're ready for you. Dr. Gleason, he's going to basically wrap it up at this point and kind of give you that time frame like that.
Yeah, well, it's always tough to follow Bob, but you know, here's the summary. We've reviewed a lot of things, and you've heard a lot of tremendous comment from the public and also from the water management districts here today. We had brought to you, suggested 4 different alternative water supplies to look at. One is to continue to use the upper Florida aquifer, if not for long-range alternative water supply, but maybe even for short-term, kind of bridge the gap between some longer-term supply and what you're doing right now. Also, I think there's been a lot of emphasis put on surface water, in using surface water and storing surface water in reservoirs. I think Kirby pointed out that there's something like 300 million gallons a day available in the county. And surface water has been used very successfully, been treated very successfully. Surficial aquifer is another possibility that we have brought up. It is being used by the city of Vero Beach. Desalination, another possibility. There's lots of seawater. You're adjacent to the ocean. That's a possibility as well. And I think a number of speakers brought up the need to conserve water. And I think the Indian River County has every intention of doing that. Right now they're recycling 100% of their wastewater and intend to continue that trend. Also to investigate the capture of stormwater as well, and to utilize it to reduce the overall burden on the upper Florida aquifer. Our intent, as being under contract, CDM being under contract to the county, if I could have the next slide, is to investigate each of these 4 different alternatives. And there's a number of steps involved in that. Investigating the technical feasibility of each one of these, and also determining whether they can be implemented in a timely fashion, because we still are facing that 2011 deadline. We've got to have something, we've got to have something new in place by 2011. We'll go through the steps of identifying the permitting issues associated with each of those 4 different alternatives. We will develop the budget level estimates, cost estimates for each of those options. And we'll also point out the historical successes with similar projects. For instance, surface water treatment by Tampa Bay Water. Tampa Bay developed a reservoir and has a successful surface water treatment plant. That sort of thing to show where there is precedent for different alternatives. And we'll bring that to you. And I just wanted to point out the schedule that we're looking at. I think Mr. Olson indicated that what we're talking about here is, in order to get something actually implemented by 2011, a decision needs to be made in about 5 or 6 months, spring, late spring, summer, early summer. That decision, a decision has to be made at that point in time to go through the pretty rigorous steps of the design, permitting, actual implementation, construction of the project, to have it online and producing water by 2011. So what we would intend to do is to go through the analysis of each of those 4 different alternatives, and to come back and with the results of that investigation, bring it before you for your decision at some point this spring.
Okay. Thank you. If there's no further, Eric, any closing, or if there's no further comments, I thank all of you for coming and attending today, and this has been very informative, and we look forward to some good results. So we'll adjourn the meeting now. Thank you.